Well, over time, I've gotten into certain rhythms with the preaching I try to do in a calendar year. This year has really challenged that. But I have certain things that I try to accomplish each year in order to give a steady, balanced diet from the scriptures. And so, for example, every year I try to end the year by preaching one of the Gospels on Sunday morning. This year's going to be Luke, by the way. Last year was John. And one thing that I started a little bit more recently, actually last year, was that in the fall, on Wednesday nights, I like to choose a person of faith from the Old Testament whose life and story can encourage us and inspire us and give us strength and show us the way to be faithful and truly live our lives well before the Lord. So that's what I want to do beginning this week in our Wednesday nights this fall. Last year, that figure of faith was David. Some of you may recall Colby and I actually co-taught that series together. The last time I had Colby preach on a Wednesday night was in March. We haven't had Wednesdays since, so I think I will think twice before I ask Colby to speak again. But we worked together on that series. We were talking about this man who is chasing after God's heart. We looked at his Psalms. We looked at his stories. And the hope was that by looking at someone so inspired to chase after God's heart, that we would be too. That we would find the connection between this person from so long ago and learn something from it. And that ended up being one of my favorite series to study, to work with Colby with, and to share with you last year. So I want to do something like that again this fall. And I had a person in mind when we started this year, but I've changed it up. And I've chosen someone that I think really might be fitting for us right now. I settled on Moses. Because I just think that Moses is the kind of person that we can really learn a lot from right now. The kind of person he is as a person of faith, the kind of person he is as an influential spiritual leader, someone who changes the lives of the people who are around him. We're going to spend our Wednesdays with Moses this fall. And of course, that's not going to be a verse-by-verse study because that would take us well beyond the fall. But I've selected some stories from the part of Moses' life that I think can be really, really pertinent to us. And it's also the part of Moses' life that I imagine to be the most difficult challenge of all that Moses faced as a leader and as a person of faith. And as I say that, you may be wondering, because you do have some options here, what do you think was the most difficult challenge that Moses faced in his life? What if you looked at kind of the big chunks of his journey, what would have been the most steep obstacle that Moses found himself up against? Was it, for example, growing up in the house of Pharaoh? That had to have been tough, right? Growing up in two worlds, in a sense. Growing up kind of belonging to two different groups of people, but then again, not really, because the Egyptians look at you and they see a Hebrew, and the Hebrews look at you and they don't quite see one of their own either. And so this is a time in Moses' life when he's growing up, it's really tough. And if you recall, that part of his life sort of ends by going up in flames. By the end of his upbringing in Egypt, he is a man on the run. He's running for his life. He's running away from home. He is a person not with two peoples, but with no people. And he finds himself a shepherd in Midian. That's a challenging time. Was it as challenging as when Moses returned to Pharaoh? Like this big showdown with who would have been the most powerful human person in the whole world that they knew of at the time. And here Moses he's standing up to Pharaoh on behalf of a people who aren't even really sure they want him to be their leader, who aren't really all that sure that they're trusting him just yet, who maybe just haven't quite caught on to the dream he's dreaming yet, that they could actually be free from slavery in Egypt. Or was it what happened next? The journey afterwards. The journey through the wilderness. Off the map. Can you imagine leading a nation in tents? Can you imagine preparing a people to stand and live in the presence of a holy God and keep the faith? And keep all those people together as the days turn into weeks, turn into months, turn into years, turn into decades of wandering. And are we there yet? They don't know when this is going to end. In the wilderness, no end in sight. All this to say, at every phase in the life of this man whose life we're going to be spending the fall looking at together, at every phase, Moses has some truly difficult obstacles to overcome. And that is, of course, a blessing to us because it's part of what makes his life so important to listen to. It's part of what makes his story so teachable for us. Because throughout all of these trying situations, Moses learns and he grows and he stumbles and he leads. And we can learn from the way he faced each step of this journey. Now, to get back to my question, which one of these is most difficult? It's kind of hard to say. I guess we don't have to say. Probably one of the last two of those, more so than the first. But even then, something I want us to think about is that we're dealing with two very different kinds of challenges here, aren't we? Two very different problems. So on the one hand, going back to Pharaoh, this is a battle with a known enemy. If you're going to set Israel free, there's one road through which you got to go. That's got to go through Pharaoh. And he is a formidable opponent, but the opponent is clear and it is known, and you know what you've got to do. You've got to get through him if you are going to be free. On the other hand, that journey in the wilderness is kind of this great unknown. Here they are. It's a journey through a place that they don't know, to a place that they've never laid eyes on, following a God who is present with them, but they cannot themselves see, and they don't know which roads, or how long it's going to take, or even what they're going to find when they get there. It's all this big unknown. Two challenges, very different. And both of these challenges are going to be a struggle for Moses. They're going to bring some pain and difficulty to his life. But even the pain and difficulty of these struggles is different in each case. Like, for example, when you think about how painful it would have been for Moses to go back and stand up to Pharaoh. Like, it's all building up to this moment, right, when he walks through the door. And he's taking on this challenge. And over the next however much amount of time, it's this incredibly stressful and difficult period of his life as he tries to convince the Israelites to go with him and as he stands up in front of Pharaoh. On the other hand, there's the journey. And it's not sharp and acute. It's a lingering, slow grind. And they're free from slavery. But now Moses has got to carry the burden of leading this people day after day, week after week, over every hill and every valley, and deal with the daily problems, the complaining, the complacency, the quarreling, the never-ending worrying about life, when so much around them is unknown. There are spiritual factors to these challenges, but even they are a little bit different. In Egypt, the people are learning to stand with God as God takes on all the other so-called gods and Pharaoh and powers of the other people's world, which is pretty much what the 10 plagues are, right? God is time and time again, 10 times, proving himself greater. And Israel's learning to trust in that fact. But then on the other hand, the challenge is a little different. How do we stand before God? This holy God who is journeying with us, who's invited us into this covenant with him, but we have to be a certain kind of people to be in his presence. We got to learn how to obey him. We got to learn how to please him and stand before him in his holiness, in his power. So we can see how these two challenges that Moses faces, they're two very different kinds of challenges. We could call them, for simplicity, the known and the unknown. And in this series, we're going to be focusing on the last of those two things. We're going to be asking, what can we learn from Moses? From the way that he faces the great unknown as he journeys in the wilderness. What can we gain from that? Like, how does the unknown strain us and test us? How does the unknown grow us and bless us, depending on how we respond to it? What do we do when we're in one of those times where life is so disorienting and we don't know how long it's going to last and we don't have the known and the normal to fall back on? What do you do then? What sort of dangers creep in then? What sort of sins and attitudes grow in that environment? How do we deal with the grind when the journey of faith is long without it just wearing us out, turning us bitter, losing our hope? How do we face the great unknown like Moses faced it, with a deeper kind of faith? That's what this series is, I hope, going to help us to think about. Because, one thing, broadly speaking, that I find really fascinating about the story of Moses is that even as difficult as it is for him and God's people to stand up to Pharaoh and face the known challenge, we're calling it, even as difficult as that is, that journey in the wilderness into the unknown, it really seems to test them even more. Do you agree with that? It seems to strain them, even to the point of breaking just a little. Why is that? Why do you think that the unknown is so difficult to deal with? Well, for one, could it be that it's because the problems that we see, the ones we know are right in front of us, they're just easier to focus on, right? We see them right in front of us. They're plain and clear, And we feel the weight of them because they're just right there and we know we've got to deal with it. And so we have to respond. And we see this a little bit in Moses' story when God first calls him, in fact. This is Exodus chapter 3. If you want to turn there in a Bible, we read this passage just a second ago in our scripture reading. When God calls Moses in Exodus 3, one thing that is worth noting is he lays out the whole plan. How God intends to both deliver Israel from their known enemy, Pharaoh. For his plan is to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, verse 7 says. But keep reading. He also plans and tells Moses from the start that he plans to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And this is God's plan from the start. From the moment he calls Moses, he's calling him to take part in both of these challenges, the known and the unknown. And do you know what Moses does when he hears God's plan? Excuse me, I think you've got the wrong guy. You know, he 5 times raises 5 different objections when God calls him to lead his people. Every one of those objections is about the known problem. They're all about standing up to Pharaoh. So first he says, who am I that I'm going to stand up to Pharaoh? And why would I go back? Because when I go back, the people are just not going to listen to me. This is not even going to get off the ground. And even if they listen, who's to say that they would believe me? And don't you know, Lord, I'm not eloquent. How could I convince Pharaoh to let your people go? And then lastly, of course, please just send someone else. Moses is out of excuses. Just wants someone else to go. Remember, God told him the whole plan. But what is Moses focused on? That part that's right there before his eyes, the thing he can see, the one that's in his sights, and he thinks, I can't do that. But actually he can. And actually it turns out that the second part is the part that gives him even more trouble, presses his limits. It's in the wilderness that the people start grumbling and stumbling and throwing such fits, right? It's not in Egypt that they're fashioning the idol. And it's not in Egypt that Moses throws down the tablets and breaks them. It's not in Egypt that Moses is finally so worn down that he disobeys God and strikes the stone with his stick and produces the water and doesn't get to enter the promised land. But in the beginning, he's so focused on this one thing. It's just easier to focus on those things that are right there before us. The unknown can kind of surprise us, sneak up on us, catch us off guard. But you know, Ephesians reminds us that our greatest challenges are not always the ones that we can see right there in front of us. Our struggle, ultimately, is not against flesh and blood. Our struggle is against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realm, says Ephesians chapter 6. That's the greater challenge, it says. It's the one that matters more. But the trouble is, if you're like me, the problems that are right there in front of me, even sometimes when they're not so important, capture all of my focus, capture all of my attention, because they're the ones that feel so pressing and urgent, especially when the journey is long, like the one that the Israelites will be in the wilderness. We notice that this is the case for not just Moses, but Israel too. When God is doing wonders right before their eyes, they stand strong with him in Egypt. But when do they start to struggle? They start to struggle when God is up in the cloud on the mountain, and they're down there waiting for something, waiting for a word. And they're meant to be down there working on being faithful people, looking in their hearts, resolving to live by the law that God has given them. But it's kind of an out of sight, out of mind thing, right? As they wait for the unknown of when they're going to take their next move, suddenly they're getting off track again. How easy it is for us to focus on the things that are right there in front of us. But when we face the unknown, it can be easy to lose sight of the things that matter most. It's part of what makes the unknown so challenging. And of course, the other part, maybe the greater part, is that wrestling with unknowns is just hard to tolerate. It's just plain hard. It can really test us when we're dealing with unknowns. If we're not careful, it can bring out the worst in us. Don't we see this in the wilderness too? How many times when Israel faces that next unknown, what do they keep saying over and over again? You remember? Well, I wish we had never left Egypt. Can you imagine saying that? Pharaoh may have enslaved us and killed our children, but at least we knew what we were up against. Our slave masters worked us to the bone, but at least we knew we had food on the table and a roof over our heads. It sounds kind of ridiculous to you and me, maybe. But it just goes to show how little tolerance or how difficult it is to tolerate that feeling of being in between, that feeling of unknowns. It's hard to have faith in God when you can't see him. He's in that cloud, but I don't see his face. It's hard to keep your hope up when you don't know how much further the promised land is, and when you look around, it doesn't look like promised land, it looks like a desert. It's hard to keep your trust where it belongs when you can't really do anything about the basics even. They can't go out and grow food or find food or go buy it at the store. They've got to totally trust in God to provide them what they need. And if you're trusting in God, that's a great relief, right? But if you're struggling with that trust, it's like you're stuck in this unknown. And it builds and it has this cumulative weight. And finally, they're saying, I'm done having faith in what I can't see. I'm going to make a God that I can see. And they build that idol. And then finally, they say, I'm not going to hope in a place that I'm going to. I'm going to hope in a place I remember being in before. And they talk about going back to Egypt. And even Moses finally says, I'm not going to wait on God to provide for me. I'm going to strike that rock. I'm going to strike out on my own, provide what I need. These things just go to show that the unknown is difficult and powerful. So what can we do when we face them? What should we do? That's what this series is going to be all about. We're going to be talking about that question as we look at Moses' journey into the great unknown. And so we'll have time to come back to that question again and again. But of course, I want to provide some starting points tonight that we will probably come back to also as we go. The first one is quite simple, but I don't know if there's a more important one. And that is that unknown is not the same as alone. Unknown is not the same as alone. And when Moses and the Israelites are in the wilderness, they are in a time of great unknown, but they are not alone. And neither are we. And when they're paying attention, God proves that fact in innumerable ways. There is the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. There is the manna and the quail from heaven, and there is the water from the rock. There is that cloud on Mount Sinai, and there is that tabernacle right in the middle of their camp, going where they go, every step of the way. It may be hard to keep that trust alive, but the evidence is there. God is with them. They may face many unknowns, but they are not alone. And it's important for us to remember that too. God also provides for us. He is our pillar, providing stability, showing us the way. God has made us in His church to be the tabernacle in which His presence dwells. As Hebrews remind us, God has promised, I will never leave you, nor will I forsake you. Unknown, not the same as alone. And secondly, unknown is difficult. But difficult is not always bad. It may not be pleasant. But difficult times can awaken a sense of urgency sometimes, remind us of what matters most. The book of Hebrews, which we studied at the start of the year, has this big, long analogy just like that, comparing us to those very people who journeyed in the wilderness and saying to us, just like them, we've got a goal in mind. We are striving to enter that rest, and that's why it's so important that just like them, we pay attention so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience that they had in the wilderness. And if you go just one verse further, we find that God has given us His word as one thing that profoundly helps us in that regard, because it touches our hearts and prunes us and convicts us and shapes us in those places that we cannot see, in our hearts and in our minds, prepares us for that road ahead. That may be difficult, but that is not a bad thing at all. It's a very good thing. And of course, the difficult things are, in the end, what make us grow. You know what James says when it says, remember that your trials, the wilderness of unknowns, produces good things. Steadfastness, maturity, completeness, so that you are lacking nothing before our Lord and King. In a way, you could say that the great unknown is part of what makes Moses so very great. It's part of what makes Moses who he was and why we admire him and look to him as a leader. Because in the unknown, Moses learned to draw near to God. He drew so near to God that he saw His glory. And when he came down from the mountain, his face was shining. It changed him in a way that everyone who saw him could see. And I can think of nothing greater that could come out of our time studying the life of Moses than for it to help us in some small way to do what he did when he faced the great unknown. Draw near to God. Draw deeper in your faith so that we may see His glory and that the world may see the difference in you and me. Well, as Mark mentioned in his prayer, there are other good things that come with unknowns, and one of those is the opportunity. As the world right now faces many unknowns together, we may have opportunities not just to embrace our own unknowns in faith, but also to be a guide, like Moses was a guide to God's people, guiding others to the faith and hope we have because of Jesus. Maybe somebody tonight needs to respond to that hope yourself, to put on Christ in baptism. Maybe for others, the message for you is that in a time of great unknown, you are not alone. And these difficult things we're going through, they can produce something good in us when we turn them over to God. However you may be called or challenged tonight, we offer this moment to respond while we stand, while we sing.